Before we begin tonight, I want to quickly thank Nobuseri for the story idea. If you have any ideas, make sure to comment them below, and also let us know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. We have listeners from São Paulo to Seoul, from Edinburgh to Nairobi, and there is something remarkable about knowing that somewhere out there, thousands of you are lying in the dark at this very moment, waiting to learn something that most people will never sit still long enough to hear. Tonight's story is among the most carefully researched this channel has ever produced. It involves a real document, a real agency, real redactions, and a theory so quietly alarming that the men who classified it did not do so because they thought it was wrong. They did it because they were afraid it might be right. This is the Reset Protocol. Somewhere inside the United States Intelligence Archive, among millions of declassified documents spanning decades of Cold War paranoia and global surveillance, there is a file that should not exist. It is not a weapons blueprint. It is not an assassination order. It is not even technically classified as secret. It is a book. A slim, quietly written volume published in the early 1960s by a man named Chan Thomas. The title is The Adam and Eve Story. And for roughly 50 years, the Central Intelligence Agency maintained a restricted copy of it, partially redacted, the missing sections unaccounted for, a classification stamp bearing a date that itself raises more questions than it answers. Why would the world's most powerful intelligence apparatus archive and partially censor a fringe geological theory? That is the question Daniel Cross asked himself on a quiet April evening in 2023, when he pulled the document from the CIA's own electronic reading room. It is the question that would consume the next 14 months of his life. And it is the question we're going to follow tonight, down through layers of Cold War bureaucracy, classified science, vanished manuscripts, and a pattern in the geological record that civilization's keepers may have understood and quietly feared for longer than any of us have been told. The Discovery. April 2023. Daniel Cross is not the kind of person who appears on television. He does not have a podcast. He does not sell merchandise. He is, by training and temperament, an archival researcher. The kind of quiet professional whose entire career is built around reading things that other people have stopped paying attention to. He has worked in that capacity for 11 years. Government contracts, legal discovery, academic archives. He is, in the most straightforward sense of the word, a reader. A very good one. On the evening of April 17th, 2023, Cross is logged into the CIA's CREST database, the Civilian Records Electronic Storage Tool, a publicly accessible portal containing millions of pages of declassified intelligence documents. He is, at this moment, searching for something unrelated. Background material for a client. A routine search. He types in a keyword. He does not later remember exactly what the keyword was. What he remembers is the result. A document appears in the search results with a title he does not recognise. The Adam and Eve Story. Author listed as Chan Thomas. Date of publication, 1965. And below that, a detail that stops his eyes cold. Declassification date, June 2013. Not the date of original classification. That field is absent. Not the reason for classification, that field is absent too. Just the date it was finally let go. Partially. Cross downloads the document. He reads the first 30 pages in under an hour. He is not a geologist. He is not a physicist. But he has spent over a decade reading classified and formally classified documents, and he knows, with the specific intuition of someone who has handled a great many of them, when a file has been managed, shaped, trimmed around its edges. The table of contents lists 7 chapters. The document contains 4. 3 chapters are simply missing, referenced in the table, titled, and gone. The titles of the missing sections are, he will later note in his personal research log, what first convinced him this was worth pursuing seriously. Not because they are dramatic, because they are specific. The mechanism of crust displacement, government survival requirements, future event modelling. Those are not the chapter titles of a fringe theorist. Those are the chapter titles of someone who believed they were writing a technical report, someone who expected it to be read and acted upon by people with the authority to act. The author, Nobody Talks About Chan Thomas is not a name that appears in standard scientific histories. He is not cited in geology textbooks. He did not receive academic honours. He did not publish in peer-reviewed journals. By every conventional measure of intellectual legitimacy, he does not exist. But Cross begins to pull at the thread. Chan Thomas was, by professional training, an electrical engineer. His background included work in electromagnetic systems, the kind of applied physics that sits at the intersection of theoretical modelling and practical hardware. During the 1950s and early 1960s, this placed him adjacent to a world that was, at the time, among the most classified on Earth, the burgeoning apparatus of American defence research. Cross finds no direct evidence that Thomas held a security clearance. He finds no personnel records. What he finds instead is a pattern of proximity, conference listings, obscure academic correspondence, citations in the footnotes of other documents, that places Thomas within the orbit of military research circles without ever officially placing him inside them. He is, in every formal sense, a civilian. But he is a civilian who appears to have known things. The Adam and Eve story was published in 1965 through a small press. It sold modestly. It was reviewed occasionally, almost always dismissively, by the scientific establishment. And then, with a speed that Cross finds unusual for even unpopular ideas, it simply stopped. No follow-up publications, no speaking engagements, no academic responses beyond the initial dismissals, no indication of what Thomas was working on next, or why he stopped being publicly visible with a suddenness that Cross, in his research log, describes as the kind of silence that does not happen by accident. Thomas disappears from the public record of scientific discussion with a completeness that is, Cross notes, almost professionally managed. The missing chapters. Cross spends the better part of 3 weeks attempting to locate the missing sections of the Adam and Eve story through every legitimate archival channel available to him. University library systems, National Archive searches, interlibrary loan networks, small press records, the Library of Congress. Nothing. The 3 missing chapters, the mechanism of crust displacement, government survival requirements, and future event modelling, do not appear in any publicly accessible archive anywhere in the United States. The small press that published the original book closed in the 1970s. The printing plates are gone. The editorial records, if they ever existed, are unaccounted for. What Cross finds instead are references, citations in other works, fringe works, mostly, the kind that academic libraries file under alternative theory, and that tend to accumulate dust, that refer to claims Thomas allegedly made in sections not present in any edition Cross can locate. From these citation trails, Cross begins to reconstruct, with the careful qualification of a man who knows he is working from second-hand sources, what the missing chapters may have contained. The picture that emerges is not of a man spinning mythology. It is of a man attempting to formalise, in the technical language of mid-century applied science, a model for something that geological records suggest has happened before, and that he believed, with apparent conviction, was going to happen again. Intelligence interest. The 1960s. To understand why an electrical engineer's geological theory ended up in a CIA archive, you have to understand something about the atmosphere of American intelligence in the decade that produced it. The 1960s were not simply the decade of the space race and civil rights, and the cultural upheavals that history has tended to emphasise. For the men and women who worked within the classified architecture of American national security, they were something else. A decade of profound and systematic fear about the unknown. Nuclear war was the acknowledged threat, but the intelligence community had, by the early 1960s, also developed what internal documents of the era describe as a deep institutional anxiety about threat categories that had not yet been named, non-nuclear existential risks, global disruptions of a scale that conventional strategic planning was not equipped to model, events that did not fit into the logic of geopolitical competition because they were not caused by any competing power. Cross uncovers, through freedom of information requests and existing declassified material, fragments of internal CIA memos from this era that reveal analysts were actively tasked with reviewing unconventional scientific theories, not because they were believed, but because the potential consequences of ignoring them were considered too significant to dismiss without examination. One analyst note from an internal review dated approximately 1966 reads in its partially visible form, "If periodic geophysical resets occur, strategic planning. Assumptions collapse. Duration of review, 60 days. Classification, restricted." The language is careful, bureaucratic. It does not say the theory is correct. It says that if it were correct, everything would change. That is a different statement, and it is the statement of a professional who takes seriously the logical implications of uncomfortable possibilities. The infrastructure timeline. Cross is methodical. He does not move quickly. He spends weeks mapping what he calls the infrastructure timeline, the sequence of large-scale government construction and organisational development that unfolded across the late 1950s and through the 1960s, cross-referenced against the dates of Thomas's manuscript and the CIA's documented interest in fringe geophysical theory. What he finds is not individually remarkable. Any historian of the Cold War knows these facts. The expansion of underground bunker networks beneath the eastern seaboard began in the late 1950s. The construction of the NORAD facility inside Cheyenne Mountain was completed in 1966. Continuity of government protocols, the systematic planning for how the executive branch of the United States would survive and continue to function after a catastrophic event, were formalized, expanded, and made permanent during the same period. The official explanation for all of this is nuclear war, and that explanation is legitimate. Nuclear war was real. The threat was real. The preparation was rational. But Cross notes something that the standard historical account tends to flatten. The design specifications of many of these facilities go beyond what nuclear war survivability alone would require. The food storage capacities, the water filtration systems, the self-contained atmospheric processing, the depth and scale of certain underground installations. Nuclear war is a short-event catastrophe. It is devastating, but it is relatively brief. The civilization that survives it re-emerges into a damaged but recognizable world within years, not centuries. The facilities Cross is mapping were not designed for years. Some of them, by the specifications Cross locates in declassified engineering documents, appear designed for generational occupation. He writes in his research log, "Either the people who built these were deeply irrational about nuclear timelines, or they were planning for something that does not fit cleanly inside the nuclear threat model." The pole shift theory. The central claim of Chan Thomas's manuscript is, in its broadest form, a version of what geologists call crustal displacement theory. The idea that Earth's lithosphere, the rigid outer shell of the planet, is capable under certain conditions of shifting dramatically and rapidly relative to the interior, causing massive rapid geographic displacement. New regions thrust toward the poles, polar regions thrust toward the equator, the redistribution of land and ice and ocean so sudden and so complete that the world as known would, in the span of days or weeks, become unrecognizable. This is not, on its face, a novel idea. Versions of it have existed in scientific literature since the early 20th century. Charles Hapgood, a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire, published extensively on the subject in the 1950s and 1960s, and received, unusually, a letter of interest and encouragement from Albert Einstein on the subject, written 2 years before Einstein's death. The scientific mainstream has generally treated crustal displacement as an interesting but insufficiently supported hypothesis. The timescales proposed by its advocates have been considered wildly implausible by conventional geology, which operates on the assumption that large geophysical changes occur over millions of years, not thousands. But Cross locates something in the declassified Navy oceanographic records of the 1950s that gives him pause. During this period, the United States Navy conducted extensive surveys of the ocean floor as part of a broad Cold War-era effort to understand the underwater geography relevant to submarine operations. These surveys were classified. Many remain so, but portions were declassified in stages over the following decades, and Cross pulls what is available. What he finds in the sediment layer analysis is a sequence of deposits that, in several locations across both the Atlantic and Pacific basins, show discontinuities that the standard models of gradual sedimentation cannot easily explain. Layers that should represent tens of thousands of years of slow accumulation appear to be compressed, laid down over periods that the physical evidence suggests were dramatically shorter than the timeline allows. The analysts who reviewed these surveys in the 1950s noted the anomalies. The internal language Cross observes is careful and precise. Rate of sediment transition inconsistent with known depositional models. Further study required. Further study, as far as the public record is concerned, was not pursued. Antarctic anomalies, 1958. In 1957 and 1958, the world's major scientific nations undertook one of the most ambitious cooperative research efforts in the history of science. The International Geophysical Year, a coordinated global investigation of Earth's physical systems spanning the atmosphere, the oceans and the polar regions. Antarctica was among the primary research theatres. Expeditions from 12 nations established research stations, drilled ice cores, mapped subsurface geology, and documented for the first time with any systematic rigour what lay beneath the continent's 2-mile-thick ice sheet. What they found in the ice and beneath it was, in several respects, not what the standard model of gradual climate change would have predicted. Tropical plant, fossils, discovered beneath layers of ice so old that their presence required either an impossibly warm, ancient Antarctica or an Antarctica that had, at some point in the geologically recent past, occupied a dramatically different geographic position. Rapid freeze indicators in the ice core records, evidence that in certain layers the transition from temperate conditions to full glaciation occurred not over millennia, but over periods that the physical markers suggest were much, much shorter. The official scientific interpretation of these findings attributed them to ancient climate variation, operating over vast timescales, reasonable, defensible, consistent with the accepted model. The internal memos tell a slightly different story. Cross locates, through the National Archives, fragments of internal correspondence from American expedition participants that were not included in the published reports. One of them, written by a geophysicist whose name has been redacted, reads in E. Part, rate of transition in core samples remains unresolved. Published interpretation represents conservative consensus. Internal team opinion divided. Minority view. Transition occurred in decades, not millennia. Recommend further restricted analysis. The recommended further restricted analysis does not appear in any public record Cross can locate. The minority view was not published. The suppressed model. 14 months into his investigation, Cross receives a phone call from a number he does not recognise. The caller is a retired geophysicist. The caller will not give his name. He will not confirm his institutional affiliation. He will speak only on the condition of complete anonymity, and he will speak only once. Cross records the call. He does not publish the recording. He transcribes it in his research log. The retired scientist tells him that during the early Cold War period, he gives no specific date, but Cross estimates from context that he is speaking of the late 1950s and early 1960s. A small number of classified research programs within the American defense science infrastructure were tasked with modelling scenarios that the public geophysical literature did not address. Among them was a scenario involving cyclical weakening and collapse of Earth's magnetic field. The magnetic field is not merely a navigational convenience, it is the planet's primary shield against solar radiation. Without it, or with it significantly reduced, the surface of the Earth becomes progressively more exposed to energetic solar particles that the atmosphere alone cannot fully deflect. The biological and atmospheric consequences of a sustained magnetic collapse are not, the scientist tells Cross, fully modelled in any published literature, because the published literature has never had cause to model them at the scales the classified programs were examining. In the classified models, the retired scientist says, the sequence ran as follows. Magnetic field weakening begins, solar radiation penetration increases, atmospheric chemistry begins to shift. This creates feedback effects in ocean circulation, precipitation patterns, and ultimately in the mechanical stability of the ice sheets, which are not merely cold water frozen on top of a stable continent, but dynamic systems whose weight and distribution affect the rotational balance of the planet itself. And Chan Thomas's manuscript, the scientist tells Cross, described this sequence, not in the precise technical language of the classified models, but in the conceptual architecture, the mechanism, the cascade. The manuscript mirrored projections that were not public, the retired scientist says. That is what alarmed them. The psychological threat. There is a category of classified information that most people, when they think about government secrecy, do not consider. They think of weapons programs, they think of intelligence sources, they think of diplomatic communications that could cause international incidents if released. But within the classified framework of the American intelligence community, there has always existed a second and more philosophically troubling category. Information classified not because it must be kept from foreign adversaries, but because it cannot be safely given to anyone. Cross discovers this doctrine through a series of declassified internal planning documents from the 1960s that deal not with specific secrets, but with the general theory of secrecy, the question of when and why governments withhold information from their own populations, and what the criteria for such decisions should be. The language of these documents is abstract and careful, but the logic is clear. Certain categories of information, the planning doctrine held, are not dangerous because they would help an enemy. They are dangerous because they would destabilize the domestic population in ways that could not be managed or reversed. The social contract between a government and its people depends on a shared assumption of meaningful continuity, that tomorrow will be broadly like today, that the future is navigable, that individual and collective effort toward goals makes sense. Information that fundamentally undermines this assumption, that suggests the continuity is illusory, that the future is not navigable on the terms civilization has established, is not information that any government is equipped to release. Not because the government does not trust its people, but because no society has ever developed the institutional infrastructure to process and integrate such information without catastrophic social disruption. A classified review, Cross believes he has found fragments have reached a formal conclusion in 1966. Public knowledge of cyclical geophysical extinction events would destabilize civilization more completely and more rapidly than the events themselves, because the events at least have a natural timeline. The social disruption caused by widespread awareness of them would begin immediately. Thomas's manuscript was placed under restricted circulation, not because it revealed operational secrets. It was placed under restricted circulation because it revealed a pattern, and the pattern was real enough to be dangerous and unmanageable enough to be hidden. The redactions explained. Cross spends the final months of his first year of investigation doing something painstaking and methodical, following citation trails. Every fringe work that references Thomas's missing chapters, and there are several dozen of them, spread across 40 years of alternative science publishing, contains fragments of paraphrase, summary, or claimed quotation from sections that do not exist in the public copy of the manuscript. Cross catalogues every one of these references. He cross-references them against each other, filtering for internal consistency. He weights them by apparent source quality and proximity to the original publication. What he reconstructs, with the heavy qualification that he is working from indirect evidence, is a picture of what the 3 missing chapters alleged. Civilization-ending geophysical events had occurred approximately every 6,500 years throughout the geological record. Not mass extinctions in the sense that paleontology discusses, slow, multi-million-year processes, but rapid, catastrophic resets of surface conditions. Events that would, to any civilization living through them, appear to be the end of the world. The physical evidence for previous advanced human societies predating the current historical record, societies that were not primitive, that had developed technologies and organizational structures comparable in sophistication to modern civilization, had been found and suppressed across multiple archaeological sites on multiple continents, and the next cycle, window, by Thomas's calculations, fell within what he called the modern era. He did not give a precise date. He gave a range, and he placed it, by the citation evidence Cross can locate, somewhere within the 20th or 21st centuries. The redacted sections allegedly discuss the probability timeline calculations, the specific window, the mathematical model underlying the prediction. That is what was removed from the public copy. The magnetic field decline. Cross has been a researcher long enough to know that the most convincing evidence is not the evidence you look for. It is the evidence that was already there, waiting to be noticed, in the public record. He turns, in the second phase of his investigation, to what is openly available in peer-reviewed geophysical literature and in the published data of satellite monitoring programs. And what he finds there is not reassuring. Earth's magnetic field has been weakening. This is not a fringe claim. It is a measured, documented, scientifically acknowledged fact. The field has been declining in overall intensity for at least 170 years, since systematic measurement of it began in the 1840s. But the rate of decline has accelerated. Studies published in the 21st century show that the rate of weakening increased notably beginning in the 1990s and has continued to accelerate since. The South Atlantic Anomaly, a region above South America and the South Atlantic Ocean, where the magnetic field is particularly weak, has been expanding. It has grown large enough and weak enough that satellites passing through it experience elevated rates of electronic disruption and malfunction. This is a known operational problem for space agencies and satellite operators. It is discussed in technical literature. It is not in those discussions connected to any catastrophic scenario. It is treated as a navigational and engineering concern, but cross-maps the expansion rate of the anomaly against the theoretical models described by the retired geophysicist. And the trajectory is consistent, not proof, not, Cross is careful to note, anything that constitutes proof, but a data point that fits the model in a way that the model itself did not require it to fit. The magnetic field weakening that Thomas's manuscript predicted, 60 years before the satellite measurements existed to confirm it, is happening. At the rate the classified models, by the retired scientist's account, anticipated. The continuity infrastructure. Cross returns to the infrastructure mapping he began in his first months of investigation, but now extends it forward, past the Cold War and into the present. What he finds is a pattern of federal expenditure and classified construction that does not fit cleanly into any single threat model. The expansion of underground government facilities has continued steadily since the Cold War ended. This is documented partially in budget allocations and in the work of journalists and researchers who have tracked the construction of what official sources call continuity of government infrastructure. The specific locations of many of these facilities are classified. The specific capacity and purpose of others is described only in the most general terms. What Cross can document, from publicly available budget figures, from declassified construction contracts, from the work of researchers who have pursued these questions before him, is that the scale of this infrastructure goes beyond what any plausible current threat would seem to require. The hardened communication networks, the long-term food and water storage, the self-contained power systems, the depth and redundancy of the facilities themselves. Nuclear war remains the official justification. But Cross notes something that others have noted before him. Nuclear war planning in the post-Cold War era has been dramatically reduced. Treaties, arsenal, reductions, the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons from forward positions. By every formal metric, the nuclear threat has diminished since its Cold War peak. The infrastructure, meanwhile, has expanded. Cross does not conclude from this that the infrastructure is specifically and deliberately built for a geophysical reset event. He concludes something narrower and more defensible, that the infrastructure is designed for a threat that is not the officially stated one, or is designed for a threat of significantly longer duration and more complete civilizational disruption than nuclear war alone would produce. Both of those conclusions point, he writes, in the same direction. The second manuscript. Through a graduate student in the history of science at a university Cross declines to name in his research log, he learns something he has not found in any public source. Chan Thomas wrote a second manuscript. The graduate student is researching the history of fringe geophysical, theories and is located in a box of uncatalogued papers donated to a small university archive by a former small press editor. A single letter from Thomas to his publisher. The letter is dated 1968, 3 years after the publication of the Adam and Eve story. In it, Thomas refers to a follow-up work he describes as nearly complete. He gives it a title, The Next Adam. He describes it, in the letter, as containing the full technical apparatus he was unable to include in the original book, the specific mathematical models, the probability calculations, the timeline projections. He expresses confidence that it will be published. It was not published. No copies of The Next Adam exist in any library, any archive, any collection that Cross or the graduate student is able to locate. The manuscript, if it was ever completed, has vanished as completely as if it had never been written. The publisher's records show no receipt of it. The letter is the only evidence. It existed. Cross adds the title to his research log under a category he has created for the investigation. Things that disappeared when they shouldn't have. The list is longer than he expected it to be. The whistleblower. The contact comes in the form of an encrypted message to an email account Cross uses for research correspondence. The sender's identity is masked. The message is brief. It says, "I know what you are looking for. I know because I was in the room where they named it. You have most of the pieces. You are missing the frame. The frame is this. It was never called an apocalypse. It was called a reset event. There is a difference. An apocalypse implies an end. A reset implies a continuation of the planet, if not of the civilization." Cross responds carefully. Over the course of 2 weeks, through a series of encrypted exchanges, a fragmentary portrait emerges of the person sending the messages. A former contractor, not an employee, a contractor, which places them at a deliberate remove from official accountability, who worked in the 1990s and early 2000s within what they describe as an interagency working group tasked with studying existential risk scenarios. Not the kind that appear in public policy documents under that name: climate, pandemic, asteroid impact. The other kind, the ones that do not appear in public policy documents at all. The working group reviewed a range of classified and semi-classified research going back to the 1950s. Thomas's manuscript was among the documents they reviewed, not as a primary source, it was too old, too imprecise, but as a reference point, as one of the places where someone outside the classified system had come closest, without access to the classified data, to describing what the classified data showed. The working group had a name for what they were studying, not a code name in the conventional sense, not a project designation or a program title. An operational term, a word they used internally to describe the event they were modelling. Reset event, not extinction, not apocalypse. Reset, what the governments concluded. The most significant thing the contact tells Cross is not about the science, it is about the conclusion. The interagency working group, drawing on decades of classified geophysical research, on the magnetic field modelling, on the sediment anomalies, on the ice core data, on the accumulated evidence that something had happened before, repeatedly and at intervals, reached a formal conclusion. The event could not be prevented. This is the sentence that Cross, reading it in the contact's message, has to read 3 times. Not because it is hard to understand, because of what it implies about everything that has followed from it. If the event cannot be prevented, the question becomes not how to stop it, but how to respond to it. And the response, the formal, institutional, quietly funded and quietly built response, has been exactly what Cross has spent 14 months documenting. Infrastructure, continuity, survival capacity for a government, for a small population, for a repository of technical knowledge sufficient to rebuild from. The contact describes the strategic logic with the flat clarity of someone who has internalized it for decades. Governments concluded, the contact writes, that there were 2 options: tell everyone and watch civilization collapse under the weight of the knowledge, economies failing, social structures dissolving, the very infrastructure of survival being destroyed by the panic of the people it was meant to serve. Or tell no one, build what could be built, prepare what could be prepared, and manage the knowledge as a state secret of the most restricted category imaginable. They chose the second option. The contact does not say this with evident guilt or indignation. They say it with the specific exhaustion of someone who has lived for a long time, with the weight of a decision they did not make but cannot unknow. The catastrophe cannot be prevented, the contact writes in their final message to Cross, only survived. That is the only choice that was ever on the table. Everything else is noise. The satellite archive Cross is, by the final phase of his investigation, a different kind of researcher than he was when he began. He is more careful, more methodical, more conscious of the difference between a pattern and a confirmation, between a suggestive alignment and actual evidence. He does not make that distinction lightly by the time he reaches what he will later describe, in his published account, as the moment the investigation became something he could no longer contain within a research log. He locates, through a combination of freedom of information requests and publicly available satellite data archives, a series of records documenting solar radiation intensity measurements taken at various orbital altitudes over the past 40 years. This data is not classified. It is not secret. It is in fact available to any researcher who knows where to look for it. What it shows is a pattern of solar energetic particle events, spikes in the radiation reaching Earth's upper atmosphere, that when mapped against historical records going back through ice core proxy data, repeat at intervals. The intervals are not precise. They are not clockwork. The Earth is a physical system, not a mechanical one, and its cycles are subject to the variability of any complex dynamic process. But the pattern is there, and it is roughly consistent, not exactly consistent, not provably consistent, but roughly consistent, with a cycle of several thousand years. Thomas predicted a repeating cycle. The classified models by the retired geophysicist's account confirmed a repeating cycle. The satellite data, in its public form and without any classified context, suggests a repeating cycle. Cross does not claim to have proven anything. He's careful about this. He's careful to a degree that he admits in his published account surprised even him. But he writes in the final entry of his research log before he began the process of deciding what to do with 14 months of investigation, the data was always there, all of it, in different archives, in different agencies, in different scientific traditions, in different countries. The only thing that was ever missing was someone willing to read them all at the same time. The final realization: Cross sits for a long time with what he has. He is an archival researcher. He deals in documents. He knows, better than most, how easy it is to construct a narrative from fragments, to see a pattern because you are looking for one, to connect dots that are genuinely unrelated because the human mind is built to find connections. He knows the cognitive traps. He has, over 14 months, tried to avoid them. What he cannot avoid is the logic of a very simple question. If the Central Intelligence Agency archived and partially classified a fringe geological theory because they believed it was wrong, because it was dangerous misinformation that might embarrass the agency or mislead the public, why would they redact the specific chapters titled Government Survival Requirements and Future Event Modelling? Wrong theories do not require redaction of their practical implications. Wrong theories require refutation, or dismissal, or simply neglect. You do not remove the chapters about what governments should do in response to a threat that you believe does not exist. You remove those chapters when you do not want the public to know what governments are already doing. The CIA did not classify Thomas's work because it was fringe science. They classified it because it was not fringe enough, because it mapped, however imperfectly and however independently, onto data streams that were themselves classified, because a man without a security clearance, working from publicly available geological evidence and his own considerable analytical intelligence, had gotten close enough to a real conclusion that leaving his book in circulation felt, to the people who understood the full picture, like a risk they were not prepared to accept. That is the reset protocol, not a specific document, not a single program. A pattern of institutional behaviour so consistent, so carefully maintained, and so quietly comprehensive that it constitutes, in Cross's view, a de facto global policy. The management of cyclical catastrophe awareness as a state secret of infinite duration. The myth of water, one of the threads Cross follows in the final months of his investigation, is what he calls the global flood mythology problem. It is not a problem in the sense of a logical contradiction. It is a problem in the sense of an uncomfortable abundance of evidence. Across every major human civilization with a written or oral tradition old, enough to preserve memory of the distant past, there exists a narrative of catastrophic flooding. The biblical account of Noah and the Great Flood is the version most familiar to Western audiences, but it is far from alone. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, predating the biblical account by over 1,000 years, contains a nearly identical story. A man warned by a god, a massive vessel, a universal flood, a world remade after the waters recede. In Hindu scripture, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, the first man, who is warned by a divine fish of an impending flood and instructed to build a great boat. In ancient Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus that destroys all other human life. In Mesoamerica, the Maya text the Popol Vuh describes a great flood that preceded the current age of humanity. Among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, flood narratives appear independently in multiple distinct cultural traditions. The standard academic interpretation of this convergence is diffusion, that these stories spread along trade routes and cultural contact networks, or that they originate from common ancestors who carried the narrative with them as they dispersed across the globe. This explanation is comfortable. It is also, Cross argues, insufficient, because the flood narratives do not merely share a common story, they share a common structure of experience, a world that was, a catastrophe that came, a survival that was achieved by a select few who preserved what they could, and a reconstruction of civilization from that preserved remnant. That is not merely a shared myth. That is a shared memory of institutional continuity in the face of civilizational collapse. And if the event that generated that shared memory was real, if it was not a metaphor but a physical occurrence, something that happened within the span of human history and human memory, then the geological record should contain its signature. And Cross believes, with the careful qualification of a man who knows he is standing at the edge of what his evidence can support, that it does. The archaeology that disappeared among the most persistent claims in the alternative history literature is the existence of archaeological discoveries that imply pre-catastrophe civilizations, human societies of significant technical sophistication predating the accepted timeline of civilization's development that were discovered, documented, and then suppressed, reclassified, or made unavailable. Cross approaches this category of claim with particular care. It is the most sensational thread in the investigation and the most difficult to verify. There is the case of the Yonaguni Monument, a formation of underwater stone structures off the coast of Japan's Ryukyu Islands, discovered by divers in 1986. The formation includes what appear to be regular geometric stone structures, terraces, right angles, what appear to be stairways, at a depth that places them above sea level only during the last ice age, when sea levels were substantially lower than they are today. Mainstream geology classifies the formation as natural. A minority of researchers, including some with legitimate academic credentials, classify it as artificial. The debate has never been formally resolved. There is the case of Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, discovered in the 1990s and fully excavated beginning in the early 2000s. The site predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the invention of agriculture, by the accepted timeline, by at least 1,000 years. It is a large, complex, intentionally constructed religious or ceremonial site, built by people who, according to the standard model of human development at that time, should not have had the organizational capacity to build it. Mainstream archaeology has not suppressed Göbekli Tepe. It is too large and too well documented to suppress. But its implications for the standard model of civilization's development remain somewhat awkwardly unintegrated into the broader narrative, and there is the category Cross finds most interesting: underwater sites. The end of the last ice age, if it occurred more rapidly than the standard model suggests, would have flooded vast areas of coastal land that were, during the ice age, habitable. If any pre-catastrophe civilization existed, its most likely locations would have been coastal, and those locations are now, depending on the timeline of sea level rise, under somewhere between 60 and 400 feet of ocean water. The technology to survey those underwater regions at high resolution has existed for less than 30 years. The surveys that have been conducted have found, in a small number of locations, structural anomalies that have not been conclusively explained. Cross does not claim these are the ruins of advanced ancient civilizations. He claims they have not been adequately investigated, and he notes that the funding for underwater archaeological investigation of sites at those depths is, compared to the potential significance of the question, remarkably limited. The quiet models, the final thread Cross pursues, is one he is most reluctant to include, not because he finds it unconvincing, but because he knows it is the most difficult to document. In the years since the first generation of large-scale artificial intelligence systems became operational tools within government and defence research contexts, roughly since 2015, with acceleration through the early 2020s, a small number of researchers with connections to those institutional environments have suggested that some of these systems have been tasked with modelling geophysical risk scenarios of a kind that does not appear in public climate science. Not climate modelling in the standard sense. Climate modelling is public extensively, documented, and produces outputs that are regularly published and debated. The modelling Cross's sources describe is different in character, oriented not toward policy recommendations or emissions targets, but toward probability assessments of catastrophic discontinuity events, large-scale, rapid, irreversible changes to surface conditions, events that are not on the publicly acknowledged risk planning horizon. The AI systems tasked with this modelling are, if Cross's sources are correct, optimised for a different kind of question than the public climate models. Not, what happens if temperatures rise by 2 degrees Celsius over 50 years, but what is the probability distribution of a magnetic field collapse event within the next 500 years? What are the leading indicators? What is the optimal response strategy given a civilization with 3 to 5 years of advance warning versus a civilization with 30? These are not questions that appear in any published research. They are not questions that any government program has publicly acknowledged modelling. They are, if they exist, among the most restricted applications of the most powerful computational tools humanity has ever built. But Cross notes something that does not require classified sources to observe. The pattern of behaviour he has documented across 60 years of classified geophysical research, infrastructure development, and information management is entirely consistent with an institutional posture that would, in the 21st century, naturally evolve toward using the best available predictive tools to refine its understanding of a problem it has been quietly managing for generations. And the best available predictive tools in this era are artificial intelligence systems of extraordinary sophistication, systems that can process and integrate data streams across disciplines and timescales in ways that no human researcher can match. If the reset event is real, Cross writes, and if the people who believe it is real have been preparing for it for 60 years, then the logical next step is not more bunkers or more food storage, it is better prediction. And he notes, as a final observation, that the absence of public evidence for classified AI reset modelling would not distinguish between two possibilities: that it is not happening, or that it is happening and is being managed with the same careful institutional discipline that has characterised everything else in this investigation. Closing narration. Daniel Cross is not a prophet. He does not claim to know what is coming or when. He does not sell survival equipment. He does not have a compound in the mountains. He is an archival researcher who spent 14 months reading documents that other people had stopped reading, and who followed the thread wherever it went with the only tools he had: patience, method, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable conclusions. What he found was this: the history of Earth is not the smooth, continuous, progressively ascending story that civilization tends to tell about itself. It is punctuated. It is cyclical. The geological record contains evidence of events that the standard model of gradual change has difficulty explaining, and that the classified record by the evidence Cross has assembled has been actively managing for at least 60 years. The CIA did not classify Chan Thomas's work because they found it silly. They classified it because they found portions of it accurate, and accuracy in this case was not something they were prepared to share. The infrastructure built over the past 7 decades, the underground facilities, the continuity protocols, the hardened networks, the long-term storage, is not Cold War legacy planning that no one bothered to decommission. It is ongoing, it is expanding, and its scale and design characteristics are more consistent with preparation for a geological catastrophe than with preparation for a nuclear war that almost every other indicator suggests is less likely now than at any point in the past 40 years. The magnetic field is weakening. This is public data. The rate is increasing. The South Atlantic anomaly is expanding. These are measurements, not theories. And somewhere in a classified archive that no Freedom of Information request will ever fully open, there is a manuscript titled The Next Adam that describes, in precise technical language, the mathematical model for what happens next. Cross does not know if he is right. He says this explicitly at the end of his published investigation. He says, "I am not certain. I may be wrong. The pattern I have found may be coincidence. The sources I cannot fully verify may be mistaken or deceived. The data I have mapped may be less significant than it appears." But he also says this: the pattern is there. The data is there. The infrastructure is there. The silence. From the agencies, from the governments, from the institutional systems that would, if this were simply wrong, have every reason to say so clearly, is there. And silence, as every archival researcher knows, is its own kind of document. Human history may not be what we have been told it is. It may not be a continuous ascent from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from fragility toward permanence. It may be a series of recoveries, a pattern of civilizations that rose and built and believed, as every civilization believes, that they were the first to last forever. And it may be that the people who know this best are the ones who have been, for a very long time, building very quietly, very deep underground, for the morning after the world we know ends. Channel outro, that is the reset protocol. If you made it to the end of this one, this channel genuinely appreciates you. This is the kind of story that takes time to tell properly, and it takes a specific kind of listener to stay with it all the way, through. You know who you are. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are listening from tonight. What time is it there? What kind of darkness are you lying in? We always read these. We love knowing that this channel reaches corners of the world that the people in it would never expect. If this story made you think, if it made you want to look deeper, want to pull the thread yourself, then it did what it was supposed to do. The CIA Crest database is real. The Adam and Eve story is there. You can download it. You can read it. The redactions are exactly where Daniel Cross said they were. Everything else, as always, you get to decide for yourself. Sleep well, or don't. We understand. This has been Sleep Theories. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you possibly know. It truly makes a difference in reaching new listeners and keeping these stories coming. If you're tuning in on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It reminds us that these stories connect people across continents and time zones. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing means we can keep bringing you these deep dives into history's darkest corners. Now, let's get into it. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. The sky is clear. The ocean is calm. You're stationed at one of the most beautiful military installations in the world, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's December 7th, 1941. For most sailors and soldiers, it's a day of rest. Some are writing letters home, others are eating breakfast in mess halls or preparing for church services. The ships sit in neat rows along Battleship Row, their steel hulls gleaming in the early light. Seaman First Class James Miller stands on the deck of the USS Oklahoma, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. He's thinking about his girl back in Kansas. He promised her he'd be home for Christmas next year. The war in Europe feels distant, irrelevant. This is paradise. This is safety. In the galley of the USS Arizona, cooks are preparing breakfast for a crew of 1,500 men. The smell of bacon and coffee fills the air. Men joke and laugh. Someone hums a tune from the radio. Sunday morning, the best morning of the week. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel sleep in. The hangar doors are open. Rows of fighters and bombers sit parked wing to wing neatly, arranged for easy security. No one expects trouble. No one is on alert. Then, at 7:55 in the morning, the world explodes. The sound comes first. A distant droning that grows louder, closer, until it becomes a roar that shakes the ground. Sailors look up. They see formations of aircraft approaching from the north. Some wave, thinking they're American planes on a training exercise. Then they see the red circles on the wings, the rising sun. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft scream out of the sky. Bombs tear through the decks of battleships. Torpedoes slice through the water and rip open hulls below the waterline. Machine gun fire rakes across airfields, destroying planes before they can even take off. Within 2 hours, more than 2,000 Americans are dead. The Pacific Fleet is crippled, and the United States is suddenly, irrevocably, at war. James Miller never makes it home for Christmas. He drowns in the capsized hull of the Oklahoma, trapped in darkness as the water rises around him and 500 other men. The cooks on the Arizona never serve that breakfast. The ship explodes with such force that parts of her superstructure are found half a mile away. Most of the crew dies instantly. Those who don't burn. For generations, Pearl Harbor has been remembered as a day of infamy. A surprise attack that pulled America into the Second World War. But underneath the official narrative, a darker question has lingered for more than 80 years. Was Pearl Harbor really a surprise? Or was it a warning that leadership chose not to act on? Some believe the attack could have been prevented. Others go further, suggesting that those in power may have allowed it to happen because they needed it to happen. They needed a catalyst powerful enough to unite a divided nation and justify entry into a global conflict. Tonight, we're going to walk through the intelligence, the warnings, the decisions, and the silences that preceded one of the most devastating days in American history. We'll examine what was known, when it was known, and who knew it. We'll hear from the men who saw the signs and tried to sound the alarm. We'll trace the chain of command from radar stations to the highest levels of government. And by the end, you'll be left with a question that refuses to go away. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming, or because someone chose not to look? This is the story of the warning that was ignored. Chapter 1. A Nation Divided About War. To understand what happened at Pearl Harbor, you first need to understand the America that existed before December the 7th, 1941. This was not a nation eager for war. In fact, it was a nation desperate to avoid it. The memories of the First World War still lingered like ghosts. Millions of men had been sent overseas to fight in trenches, to die in mud and poison gas, in a conflict many Americans believed had nothing to do with them. Mothers had waved goodbye to sons who never came home. Entire towns had lost their young men to European battlefields that most Americans couldn't find on a map. When the war ended in 1918, the United States retreated inward. Isolationism became the dominant political philosophy. The message was clear. America would stay out of Europe's problems. It would protect its own borders and let the rest of the world solve its own conflicts. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was rejected by the American Senate. The ocean was wide, the homeland was safe. Never again would American blood be spilled in foreign wars. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again descending into chaos. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, preaching racial supremacy and territorial expansion. Fascism was spreading across Italy under Benito Mussolini. Spain had collapsed into civil war, and in Asia, Japan was carving out an empire through brutal military conquest. And yet, despite the growing darkness, most Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign war. Polls conducted throughout 1939 and 1940 showed that more than 80% of the population opposed direct involvement in European conflicts. The America First Committee, led by prominent figures including aviator Charles Lindbergh, held massive rallies arguing that intervention would be a disaster. Mothers who had lost sons in the First World War formed groups demanding neutrality. Politicians campaigned on promises to keep American boys out of foreign trenches. The isolationist movement was powerful, vocal, and widespread. It crossed party lines. It united urban intellectuals and rural farmers. It reflected a deep conviction that the problems of other continents were not America's responsibility. But not everyone agreed. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw the threat differently. He believed that fascism and militarism were not just Europe's problem, they were humanity's problem. He understood that if the Axis powers were allowed to dominate Europe and Asia, the security of the United States itself would eventually be at risk. He had watched Hitler's rise with growing alarm. He had read reports of atrocities in China. He had met with Winston Churchill and heard first-hand accounts of Britain's desperate struggle for survival. Roosevelt believed that American involvement was not just likely, it was necessary. But Roosevelt also understood that he could not drag a reluctant nation into war. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war. Congress would not act without public support, and public opinion was overwhelmingly against intervention. This created a political dilemma that would define the final years before Pearl Harbor. How do you prepare a nation for a war it does not want? Roosevelt began walking a tightrope. Publicly, he reassured Americans that he would keep them out of war. In his 1940 campaign for an unprecedented third term, he promised parents, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." The crowds cheered. He won the election. Privately, he worked to support Britain and China through programs like Lend-Lease, supplying weapons and resources without committing troops. The policy was sold as a way to stay out of war by helping others fight in America's place. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt declared in a fireside chat. But critics saw it differently. They argued that Lend-Lease was a backdoor to intervention, that supplying one side in a war meant taking sides, and that taking sides meant eventual involvement. Roosevelt strengthened the military. He expanded intelligence operations. He positioned naval forces in strategic locations. He did everything he could to prepare the United States for the conflict he believed was inevitable. But he could not declare war without Congress. And Congress would not declare war without public support. And public support would not materialize unless something changed. Something dramatic. Something personal. Something that made the threat undeniable. In the White House, conversations took place behind closed doors. Advisors debated strategy. Intelligence officials briefed the president on global developments. And the question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. What would it take to change the public's mind? This is where the conspiracy theory begins. Some historians and researchers believe that Roosevelt, and others in his administration, recognized that only a direct attack on American soil would be enough to unite the country. They suggest that Pearl Harbor was not simply a failure of intelligence or preparedness. They suggest it was an event that certain leaders were willing to allow because the alternative, remaining neutral while the world burned, was worse. To be clear, this is not proven. There is no document where Roosevelt writes, "Let them attack." There is no recording of a cabinet meeting where the decision is made. The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, intelligence that was not acted upon, and outcomes that aligned perfectly with strategic needs. But the question persists because the political context makes it plausible. When a leader is trapped between what they believe must be done and what the public will accept, how far might they go to bridge that gap? Would Roosevelt have risked American lives to save more lives in the long run? Would he have allowed a tragedy to prevent a greater one? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront. By late 1941, Roosevelt and his advisors knew that war with Japan was likely. Tensions had been escalating for years. Economic pressure was mounting. Diplomatic relations were deteriorating. The question was not whether conflict would come, but when and how. And in that space between inevitability and action, some believe a decision was made, not to start a war, but to let one start. In the halls of power, the calculations were cold. 2,000 lives versus 200,000. A crippled fleet versus a united nation. Short-term catastrophe versus long-term survival. If the conspiracy theory is true, then Pearl Harbor was not an attack that caught America by surprise. It was an attack that America allowed to happen. And the men who died that morning were not victims of Japanese aggression alone. They were sacrifices on the altar of strategy. Chapter 2: Rising Tensions with Japan. Japan in the 1930s was a nation transformed by ambition and desperation. After centuries of isolation, Japan had rapidly industrialized and modernized. It had built a powerful military, it had developed an empire, but it also faced a critical problem that would drive its actions for the next decade: resources. Japan is a small island nation with limited natural resources. It has little oil, limited steel, almost no rubber. To sustain its military and its growing population, it needed raw materials that it did not have, and the only way to get them was to take them from somewhere else. The solution, in the eyes of Japanese leadership, was expansion. Throughout the 1930s, Japan invaded and occupied large portions of China. The conquest was brutal. Cities were destroyed. Civilians were massacred. The world watched in horror as reports emerged from places like Nanking, where Japanese soldiers committed atrocities that shocked even hardened diplomats. Japan established puppet governments in occupied territories. It seized control of regions rich in resources. It justified its actions with rhetoric about creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a bloc of Asian nations free from Western colonialism, led by Japan. The League of Nations condemned these actions. So did the United States. But condemnation without enforcement meant nothing. Japan continued its expansion unchecked, confident that the Western powers were too distracted by their own problems to intervene. Then the United States intervened, not with troops, but with economics. In 1940, the Roosevelt administration imposed a series of trade restrictions on Japan. First, it was steel and scrap metal, materials essential for building warships and aircraft. Then aviation fuel. Japan could no longer rely on American suppliers to fuel its military machine. The restrictions tightened throughout 1941. In the summer, the United States froze all Japanese assets held in American banks. This was followed by a full oil embargo, the most devastating blow of all. Japan imported more than 80% of its oil from the United States and its allies. Without oil, the Japanese military could not function. Ships would be stranded, aircraft would be grounded, tanks would sit idle, the war machine would grind to a halt within months. From the American perspective, the embargo was a way to pressure Japan into withdrawing from China and ending its aggression without going to war. It was economic warfare, painful but preferable to sending troops. But from the Japanese perspective, it was an existential threat. In Tokyo, military and political leaders gathered in tense meetings. They reviewed stockpiles, they calculated timelines, they debated options. The numbers were stark. Japan had enough oil reserves to sustain operations for approximately 18 months. After that, the military would be paralysed, the empire would collapse, everything they had fought for would be lost. One faction argued for negotiation. Perhaps if Japan made concessions, withdrew from some territories, agreed to certain restrictions, the United States would lift the embargo. War could be avoided. Another faction argued for war. They saw the embargo as proof that the United States would never allow Japan to be a true power. Negotiation was pointless. The only option was to strike first, hard, fast and decisively, before Japan's resources ran out. The debate raged for months, but as summer turned to fall, the balance tipped toward war. The plan that emerged was bold and risky. If conflict with the United States was inevitable, Japan would not wait for its oil reserves to run dry. It would launch a preemptive strike designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. With the Pacific Fleet destroyed, Japan could seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines. By the time the United States rebuilt its fleet, Japan would control enough resources to sustain a long war. And perhaps, faced with the cost of reconquest, America would negotiate a peace that allowed Japan to keep at least some of its gains. The target was chosen: Pearl Harbor. The logic was simple. Pearl Harbor was the home of the Pacific Fleet. If the fleet could be destroyed at anchor, Japan would have months, perhaps years, of freedom to operate without American interference. The plan was unprecedented. No carrier-based strike force had ever attempted an operation at such range. The logistics were staggering. The risks were enormous. But Japanese military planners believed it could work. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, oversaw the planning. Yamamoto was a realist. He had studied at Harvard. He had served in Washington as a naval attaché. He understood American industrial power, and he had serious doubts about Japan's ability to win a prolonged war against the United States. But if war was coming, and by the fall of 1941 he believed it was, then the only chance Japan had was to strike first and strike hard. Yamamoto famously told his colleagues, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that I have no confidence." It was it was boast. It was a warning. Diplomatic talks continued throughout the fall, but they were little more than theatre. Japanese diplomats in Washington met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, presenting proposals and counter-proposals. Hull listened politely and rejected them all. The United States demanded that Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. Japan refused. Both sides knew that the talks were going nowhere, but both sides continued them anyway. Japan to buy time for military preparations, and the United States because Roosevelt had promised to exhaust all diplomatic options before going to war. By late November, the situation had reached a breaking point. American intelligence agencies were watching Japan closely. They knew that Japanese military activity was increasing. They knew that diplomatic relations were deteriorating. They knew that troop movements suggested mobilization for war. But knowing that something is coming is not the same as knowing when or where, and that is where the conspiracy theory finds its foothold. Because if American leaders knew that war with Japan was inevitable, if they understood that the embargo had backed Japan into a corner, then they also knew that an attack was likely. Some researchers argue that this was not an accident. They argue that the embargo was designed to provoke Japan into striking first, giving the United States the moral and political justification to enter the war. The timing supports this interpretation. The embargo was imposed in July 1941. Pearl Harbor was attacked in December. That's 5 months, almost exactly the amount of time Japanese planners would need to prepare a major operation. Did Roosevelt know that the embargo would force Japan's hand? Did he understand that economic pressure would lead to military action? And if so, did he accept that risk because he wanted Japan to attack? Again, this is interpretation, not proven fact. But the timeline raises uncomfortable questions. Why impose an embargo so severe that it left Japan with no option but war? Why continue diplomatic talks that both sides knew were pointless? And why leave the Pacific Fleet concentrated in one location, vulnerable and exposed? Some argue that these were reasonable actions taken by a leader trying to deter aggression without starting a war. Others argue that they were calculated moves designed to engineer the exact outcome that occurred. By late November 1941, the pieces were all in place. Japan had committed to war, the United States had drawn its line, and somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a carrier fleet was steaming toward Hawaii in absolute radio silence. 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 aircraft, thousands of highly trained pilots and sailors, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, and no one in Hawaii knew they were coming. The question is not whether American leaders knew war was coming, the question is whether they knew where and did nothing. Chapter 3. Intelligence Signals. Before the attack. Intelligence work is often a puzzle with missing pieces. You collect fragments of information, radio intercepts, troop movements, diplomatic cables, reconnaissance reports, and you try to assemble them into a picture. Sometimes the picture is clear, sometimes it is not, and sometimes you only understand what you were looking at after the fact. In the months and weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor, American intelligence agencies were collecting a massive volume of data on Japanese activity. They were intercepting Japanese diplomatic communications through a program known as MAGIC. They were monitoring naval movements, they were analysing patterns, they were watching, listening, recording, and they were seeing warning signs. Throughout the fall of 1941, intercepted messages showed that Japan was preparing for something significant. Diplomatic codes indicated that negotiations were failing. Military codes revealed increased activity across the Pacific. Fleet movements suggested mobilization. Lieutenant Commander Alwyn Kramer worked in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. His job was to translate and analyze intercepted Japanese communications. He spent his days hunched over coded messages, working through the tedious process of decryption and interpretation. In late November, the messages became more urgent. On November 19th, Tokyo sent a message to its embassy in Washington. The situation is nearing a crisis. Time is running out. On November 22nd, another message. There are reasons beyond your ability to guess why we want to settle Japanese-American relations by the 25th. Kramer knew what these messages meant. Deadlines in diplomatic communications are never arbitrary. They signal intent. They indicate that decisions have been made, but the messages were not specific. They did not say, "We are going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Instead, they painted a picture of general escalation. Something was coming. But where? The Philippines? Malaya? The Dutch East Indies? All of these were considered more likely targets than Hawaii. Still, there were clues that should have raised alarms. On November 24th, American intelligence intercepted a message from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. The message requested detailed information about ship movements in Pearl Harbor, which ships were in port, where they were moored, how many were present. This was unusual. Why would Japan need such specific information about Pearl Harbor unless it was planning an operation there? The message was noted. It was filed. It was not flagged as urgent. 3 days later, another message requested an update. Tokyo wanted to know if the information was still accurate. They wanted current data. Again, the message was intercepted, translated, and filed. No alarm was raised. Then, in late November, American intelligence intercepted a message instructing Japanese diplomats in Washington to destroy their code machines. This was a clear sign that war was imminent. When diplomats destroy code machines, it means they are preparing to cease operations. It means that communication is about to end, and that actions, not words, are coming next. Intelligence officers in Washington recognized the significance immediately. Warnings were sent to military commanders across the Pacific, including those in Hawaii. But the warnings were vague. They emphasized vigilance and readiness, but did not specify a threat. The language was cautious, bureaucratic, non-committal. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. That was the message sent to Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, on November 27th. It told him that war was likely. It told him to be alert, but it did not tell him where the attack would come. It did not identify Pearl Harbor as a potential target. It did not convey urgency beyond the general sense that something might happen soon. Kimmel read the message. He discussed it with his staff, and he concluded that the threat was primarily to American interests in the Western Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. Hawaii seemed too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Then there was the matter of the missing carriers. American intelligence had been tracking the movements of Japanese aircraft carriers throughout the year. Carriers were Japan's most powerful offensive weapons. They were the platform for launching airstrikes across vast distances. If Japan was planning a major operation, the carriers would be central to it. But in late November, the carriers disappeared. One by one, they stopped appearing in radio intercepts. Their locations became unknown. Intelligence analysts lost track of them. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer. He worked directly under Kimmel, providing daily briefings on enemy activity. On December 2nd, Kimmel asked Layton where the Japanese carriers were. Layton had to admit he didn't know. Kimmel pressed, "Do you mean to say they could be rounding Diamond Head and you wouldn't know it?" Layton replied, "I hope they would be sighted before that." It was said as a joke. Neither man believed the carriers were anywhere near Hawaii, but they were. The Japanese strike force, 6 carriers and their escorts, had left the Kuril Islands on November 26th. They steamed eastward across the North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. They refueled at sea. They avoided shipping lanes. They travelled through some of the most remote waters on Earth. And American intelligence had no idea where they were. Some analysts assumed the carriers were in home waters, preparing for operations in Southeast Asia. Others speculated they might be heading toward the Philippines, but no one seriously considered that they might be heading for Hawaii. Conspiracy theorists point to this moment as critical. They argue that losing track of Japan's most powerful weapons should have triggered alarm bells at the highest levels. They argue that if intelligence agencies could not locate the carriers, the logical assumption should have been that they were preparing for a surprise attack, and that Pearl Harbor, the largest American naval base in the Pacific, was an obvious potential target. But that is hindsight speaking. At the time, most military analysts believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be a realistic target. Conventional wisdom held that carriers could not operate effectively at such a distance. The logistics were considered too difficult, the risk too great. Naval officers in Washington ran the calculations. A carrier strike on Pearl Harbor would require Japan to send its fleet nearly 4,000 miles across open ocean, attack a heavily defended base, and then return before running out of fuel. The operation seemed impossible, or at least highly improbable. So even though the carriers were missing, even though tensions were at their peak, even though warnings had been issued, Pearl Harbor was not seen as the most likely target. And yet, some intelligence officers did express concern. Some reports suggested that Hawaii should be on alert. Some analysts noted the possibility of a surprise attack. Were those warnings heard? Were they acted on? Or were they dismissed because they contradicted prevailing assumptions? In late November, a young intelligence analyst named Rufus Bratton was working in the Army's Military Intelligence Division in Washington. He had been reviewing intercepts and was troubled by what he saw. The pattern suggested that Japan was preparing for immediate action. The deadlines were tight. The tone was final. Bratton believed that war could break out within days. He tried to convey this urgency to his superiors. He recommended that Pacific commanders be given more specific warnings. He suggested that reconnaissance flights be increased around Hawaii. His recommendations were acknowledged. but they were not fully implemented. Part of the problem was bureaucracy. Intelligence was compartmentalized. Different agencies collected different types of information and did not always share effectively. The Navy had its intelligence operation. The Army had its own. The State Department had diplomatic channels. The FBI monitored domestic threats. Coordination was poor. Part of the problem was interpretation. The same set of facts could be read in different ways depending on your assumptions. If you believed that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked, then you interpreted the intelligence to fit that belief. If you believed that Japan would strike closer targets first, then you looked for evidence supporting that conclusion. And part of the problem may have been intent. Because if leaders in Washington wanted Japan to strike first, if they needed a catalyst to bring the nation into war, then the best way to ensure that outcome was to see the warning signs, acknowledge them, and then do just enough to appear vigilant without actually preventing the attack. This is the core of the conspiracy theory. Not that intelligence agencies were incompetent, but that they were following orders to collect information, to file reports, to send warnings that were worded carefully enough to provide cover later, but vague enough to ensure that field commanders did not take decisive action. By early December, American intelligence knew that war was imminent. They knew Japan was planning military operations. They knew the carriers were missing. They knew that diplomatic relations had collapsed. What they did not know, or claimed not to know, was where the blow would fall. And on the skist morning of December the 7th, 1941, the world found out. But here's what makes the conspiracy theory so compelling. After the attack, when investigators reviewed the intelligence records, they found that almost every piece of the puzzle had been in place. The warnings had been there, the indicators had been clear, the pattern in retrospect was obvious. The question is not whether the information existed. The question is whether anyone chose to act on it, or whether someone chose not to. Chapter 4. The Broken Chain of Command. Command is a chain. Information flows up. Orders flow down. And when that chain breaks, the consequences can be catastrophic. In Hawaii, the chain was fractured long before the first bombs fell. At the top of the Pacific Fleet command structure was Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel. 59 years old, a career naval officer with decades of experience, Kimmel had been appointed to command the Pacific Fleet in February 1941. He was responsible for naval operations across the entire Pacific Ocean, a vast area of water covering millions of square miles. His headquarters were at Pearl Harbor, where the bulk of the fleet was stationed. 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, tens of thousands of sailors. This was the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, and Kimmel was responsible for keeping it safe and ready. But Kimmel faced challenges that went beyond simple military readiness. The Pacific Fleet was in transition. It had only recently been moved from its traditional base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor, a decision made to project American power westward and signal to Japan that the United States would not tolerate further expansion. But Pearl Harbor had limitations as a naval base. Its facilities were still being developed. Its defences were incomplete. And it was closer to potential threats than San Diego had been. Kimmel had requested additional reconnaissance aircraft to patrol the waters around Hawaii. He wanted more submarines to extend his surveillance range. He wanted better intelligence on Japanese movements. Many of his requests were denied or delayed. Resources were prioritized for the Atlantic, where German U-boats were attacking supply convoys to Britain. The Pacific was seen as a lower priority. Kimmel was told to make do with what he had. Still, he did not believe Pearl Harbor was at risk. This was not arrogance. It was a reasonable assessment based on the information he had been given. Intelligence reports emphasized threats to the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. The prevailing military wisdom held that Japan would strike at weaker, closer targets before challenging American naval power directly. When Kimmel received the war warning on November 27th, he took it seriously. He consulted with his staff. He reviewed his defensive posture, and he concluded that the threat was to American interests in the Western Pacific, not to Hawaii itself. He increased patrol slightly, he reviewed security procedures, but he did not place the fleet on full alert. Ships continued their normal routines. Sailors went ashore on liberty. Sunday, December the 7th, was scheduled as a day of rest. The army was responsible for the defence of the Hawaiian Islands themselves, including the air bases and installations surrounding Pearl Harbor. That responsibility fell to Lieutenant General Walter Campbell Short. 51 years old, a career army officer, Short had taken command of the Hawaiian Department in February 1941, the same month Kimmel arrived. Like Kimmel, Short believed that the greater threat to Hawaii came from sabotage, not external attack. This belief shaped his decisions in profound ways. Hawaii had a large population of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. Some military officials worried that this population could be a security risk, that saboteurs might try to damage aircraft, ships, or facilities if war broke out. Short took these concerns seriously. Throughout late November and early December, Short implemented measures to protect against sabotage. He ordered aircraft parked close together on airfields, where they could be more easily guarded. He increased security at key facilities. He focused on preventing internal threats. What he did not do was disperse the aircraft to make them harder targets in case of air attack. He did not increase air patrols over the surrounding ocean. He did not place his forces on full combat alert. Again, this was not incompetence. It was a decision based on the guidance he had received from Washington. And that guidance was vague. On November 27th, both Kimmel and Short received warning messages from Washington. The Army message to Short read, "Hostile action possible at any moment. If hostilities cannot be avoided, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This policy should not be construed as restricting you to a course of action that might jeopardize your defense. Read that carefully. The message says that hostile action is possible. It says that Japan should commit the first overt act, meaning the United States should not strike first. But it also says that Short should not let policy jeopardize his defense. It's contradictory. It tells Short to be ready while simultaneously telling him not to do anything that might provoke Japan. Short interpreted this to mean he should focus on preventing sabotage while avoiding actions that might look aggressive, like dispersing aircraft or increasing patrols. He did not want to be blamed for triggering a war through overly aggressive defensive measures. The Navy message to Kimmel was slightly different but equally vague. This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. An aggressive move by Japan is expected within the next few days. Execute appropriate defensive deployment. Again, the message confirms that war is likely, but it does not specify where the attack might come. It does not identify Pearl Harbor as a target. It does not convey the level of urgency that would justify disrupting normal operations. Kimmel and Short discussed the warnings. They agreed that the situation was serious. They agreed that vigilance was needed. But neither believed that Pearl Harbor was in immediate danger. And here is where the conspiracy theory becomes most pointed. Because the warnings sent to Hawaii were not the only warnings issued. Intelligence reports in Washington painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Messages intercepted from Japanese diplomats indicated that war would begin soon. Analysts had noted the disappearance of the carrier fleet. Some officials in Washington believed that Hawaii could be at risk. But the warnings sent to Kimmel and Short did not reflect that level of concern. Why not? Conspiracy theorists argue that this was intentional. They suggest that the warnings were deliberately softened to avoid triggering defensive measures that might have prevented or mitigated the attack. They point to the fact that Washington had access to intelligence that was not shared with field commanders. They note that higher-level officials understood the strategic picture in ways that Kimmel and Short did not. If the goal was to allow an attack to happen, to create the catalyst needed to bring the nation into war, then the best way to achieve that goal was to keep commanders in Hawaii just informed enough to avoid suspicion, but not informed enough to act effectively. This is speculation, not proof. But it explains a pattern that official investigations struggle to reconcile. How intelligence agencies in Washington could see the threat so clearly, while commanders in Hawaii remained in the dark. Consider the chain of command. Intelligence is collected by field operatives and technical specialists. It is analysed by mid-level officers in various agencies. It is summarised in reports for senior officials. Those officials decide what information to share with field commanders and how to phrase the warnings. At each step in this chain, information can be filtered, softened or withheld. And if someone at the top wanted to ensure that a field commander did not overreact, all they would need to do is control the flow of information down the chain. In the days leading up to December 7th, Kimmel and Short asked Washington for clarification. They wanted to know if the threat was serious enough to disrupt training schedules, cancel liberty, and place their forces on full alert. They were told to use their judgment. That's not guidance. That's deniability. Because if the attack succeeded, Washington could say, "We warned them, they failed to act." And if the attack was prevented, Washington could say, "We told them not to overreact and provoke Japan." Either way, those at the top, those were protected. Kimmel and Short, on the other hand, were exposed. By the morning of December the 7th, they had done what they believed was appropriate based on the information they had. Ships were in port because it was Sunday. Aircraft were parked because the primary threat was thought to be sabotage. Defensive measures focused on internal security, and then the sky filled with enemy planes. Afterward, both men would be blamed for the disaster. They were relieved of command within weeks of the attack. Their careers were destroyed. Their reputations were shattered. Official investigations would cite failures in judgment, failures in communication, failures in leadership. But some would argue that the real failure was not theirs. It was the failure of those who saw the warning signs and chose to send messages that sounded like warnings but functioned like silence. Chapter 5. The Radar Contact. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a decision made, a rare message ignored, a chance missed. For Pearl Harbor, that moment came just after 7 in the morning. Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott were stationed at the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu. The station was little more than a collection of equipment mounted on a truck, parked on a windswept point overlooking the ocean. Radar was a relatively new technology in 1941. Most military officers didn't fully understand it. The installation at Opana was part of an experimental network designed to detect incoming aircraft and provide early warning of an attack. The equipment was temperamental. The operators were still learning. Training had been minimal, but when it worked well. On the morning of December 7th, Lockard and Elliott had started their shift at 4 in the morning. Their job was to monitor the radar screen and report any unusual contacts to the information centre at Fort Shafter, the hub that coordinated radar reports and managed the air defence network. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but the truck that was supposed to pick them up and take them back to base was running late, so they decided to keep the equipment running while they waited. At 7:02, Lockard noticed something on the screen, a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The contact was strong, unusually so. He checked the equipment. Everything was functioning normally. He called Elliott over. Together they watched the blip on the screen. It was moving fast. Range, 137 miles. Bearing, almost due north. Elliott suggested they report it. Lockard hesitated. It was past their shift time. Maybe it was a malfunction. Maybe it was just a flock of birds. Radar could pick up large bird formations sometimes, but the contact kept getting stronger. Lockard calculated the speed and trajectory. Whatever it was heading directly toward Oahu. Lockard picked up the phone and called the information centre at Fort Shafter. The phone rang several times before it was answered. Most of the staff had gone to breakfast. The only person still there was a pursuit officer, a junior lieutenant named Kermit Tyler. Tyler was filling in for a more senior officer who was not on duty that morning. It was only his second day working in the information centre. He had limited experience with the radar network. He was not fully briefed on the strategic situation. Lockard explained what they were seeing. A large formation of aircraft, 137 miles out, approaching fast. Tyler listened. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Don't worry about it." Lockard pressed. This was a really large contact, bigger than anything they'd seen during training. Shouldn't someone check it out? Tyler repeated, "Don't worry about it." He later explained that he had assumed the radar contact was a flight of American bombers expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. He knew that a group of planes was due. He thought the timing matched. He didn't think it was necessary to verify, but Tyler didn't check with anyone. He didn't consult a schedule. He didn't call the airfields to confirm. He made an assumption and acted on it. Lockard hung up the phone. He and Elliot continued tracking the formation. The contact kept getting closer. 100 miles, 75 miles, 50 miles. At 30 miles out, the contact disappeared from the screen, lost in the clutter of the island's terrain as the aircraft descended toward their targets. Lockard and Elliot shut down the equipment. Their ride finally arrived. They drove back to base, talking about the strange contact and wondering what Tyler had meant when he said not to worry. 20 minutes later, the attack began. This moment has become central to the conspiracy debate, because here was a clear, unambiguous warning. Radar detected the incoming strike force more than 50 minutes before the first bombs fell. That was enough time to scramble fighters, enough time to alert the fleet, enough time to sound air raid sirens, enough time to man anti-aircraft guns, enough time to prepare. But the warning was dismissed by a junior officer who made an assumption without verification. The official explanation is simple: confusion, inexperience, bad luck. Tyler made a mistake. He didn't know any better. Lockard and Elliot followed orders and did not push back. The system failed at the worst possible moment. But conspiracy theorists ask a different question. Why was the radar network operating with minimal personnel that morning? Why was a junior officer with limited experience put in charge of coordinating reports during a period of heightened tension? Why was there no procedure to verify unusual contacts before dismissing them? Some suggest that the radar network was deliberately understaffed and under-prioritized. They argue that if leadership wanted to ensure that an attack would succeed, one way to do that would be to make sure that early warning systems were not taken seriously, to create an environment where ambiguous signals could be explained away without investigation. This is not provable, but it fits a pattern. Because the radar contact was not the only warning ignored that morning. At 6:45, more than an hour before the attack, the destroyer USS Ward was patrolling the entrance to Pearl Harbor when a lookout spotted something unusual: the conning tower of a small submarine. The submarine was in restricted waters, trying to follow an American cargo ship into the harbour. The captain of the Ward, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, ordered his guns to fire. The first shot missed. The second hit the submarine's conning tower. The submarine began to sink. The Ward dropped depth charges to finish it off. Outerbridge immediately reported the engagement by radio. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges on a submarine operating in defensive sea area." This was not ambiguous. This was not a radar blip that might be friendly aircraft. This was an enemy submarine sunk in American waters. The report was received at the headquarters of the 14th Naval District, which oversaw Pearl Harbor's defences. The duty officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Kaminsky, saw the message. He knew it was significant. He called his superior, Admiral Claude Bloch. Bloch was sceptical. There had been false submarine sightings before. He told Kaminsky to verify the report before taking action. Kaminsky tried to reach the Ward for confirmation, but radio communication was difficult. Minutes passed. More calls were made. Officers deliberated. Should they sound an alert? Should they wake up Admiral Kimmel? While they debated, time ran out. At 7:55, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Afterward, investigators would call these failures tragic mistakes, examples of how peacetime complacency and communication breakdowns can lead to disaster. But critics point out that these were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader pattern of warnings seen, reported, and then set aside. Radar detected the incoming strike force, ignored. A submarine was sunk in defensive waters, debated. Every single early warning mechanism functioned correctly. The technology worked, The people did their jobs. The information reached decision-makers, but every decision-maker chose not to act. Was it really just coincidence that every single safeguard failed at the exact same time? Or was the system designed to fail? This is the question that refuses to go away. Because if Pearl Harbor was truly a surprise, then the failures that allowed it to happen were almost impossibly unlucky. Radar worked perfectly but was dismissed. Submarines were detected and sunk but not reported effectively. Warnings were issued but phrased vaguely enough to be ignored. But if Pearl Harbor was allowed to happen, then those same failures start to look like something else. Not mistakes, choices, because the best way to ensure that an attack succeeds is not to disable the defences. It's to make sure that when the defences sound the alarm, no one listens. Chapter 6. The Attack and Immediate Aftermath. At 7:55 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack from his position in a level bomber high above the harbour. Below him, the American fleet lay at anchor in neat rows, exactly as intelligence reports had described. 8 battleships along Battleship Row, cruisers and destroyers in the harbour, aircraft parked wing to wing on the airfields. Fuchida gave the signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code that meant they had achieved complete surprise. 183 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers and level bombers descended on the harbour in coordinated waves. The attack was precise, devastating and overwhelming. Within minutes the harbour was engulfed in chaos. The first bombs fell on the airfields. At Hickam Field, Army Air Corps personnel were eating breakfast when they heard explosions. They ran outside and saw aircraft with red circles on their wings strafing the parked planes. Fuel tanks exploded. Hangars collapsed. Men dove for cover as machine gun fire tore through buildings. At Wheeler Field, rows of fighters sat parked close together. A perfect target. Japanese pilots made low passes, firing into the clustered aircraft. Within minutes, most of the fighters were destroyed or damaged beyond use. Pilots sprinted toward the few planes that were still intact, desperate to get airborne. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach an auxiliary field where a few P-40 fighters had been dispersed. They took off without orders, without clearance, without waiting for permission. They climbed into the smoke-filled sky and engaged the Japanese aircraft. They were among the few American pilots to get airborne that morning. On Battleship Row, sailors heard the explosions from the airfields and looked up to see aircraft approaching. Some still thought it was a drill. Then they saw the torpedoes in the water. The torpedoes were specially designed for Pearl Harbor. The harbour was shallow, only 40 feet deep in many places. Standard torpedoes would have hit the bottom before reaching their targets. So Japanese engineers modified the torpedoes with wooden fins that allowed them to run shallow. It was an innovation that would prove devastatingly effective. The USS Oklahoma was hit first. 3 torpedoes struck her port side within seconds. The battleship shuddered. Water poured into the hull through massive holes. The ship began to list. Sailors below decks heard the explosions and felt the ship tilting. They tried to evacuate, but the corridors were flooding. Watertight doors were being sealed to slow the flooding, trapping men inside. The lights went out. In the darkness, men scrambled upward, trying to reach the open air. The Oklahoma continued to roll. 5 minutes after the first torpedo hit, she capsized completely. Her masts touched the harbour bottom. Her hull rose into the air red with rust and covered in barnacles. Inside, more than 400 men were trapped. Some were in compartments that still had air. They pounded on the bulkheads, shouting for help. They could hear rescue crews on the outside trying to cut through the steel. But the Oklahoma's hull was thick armour plate. Cutting through it would take time. For some, help arrived. Rescue crews worked through the night, using torches to burn through the metal. 32 men were pulled out alive over the next day. For the others, no help came in time. The USS West Virginia took 6 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits. She settled into the harbour mud. leaning against the USS Tennessee, which was moored alongside her. The Tennessee was trapped, unable to move. The USS Arizona took a direct hit from an armor-piercing bomb at 8 and 6 minutes. The bomb was a modified 16-inch naval shell dropped from altitude. It punched through the deck and detonated in the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was so powerful that it lifted the entire ship out of the water. Men on nearby vessels saw a massive fireball erupt from the Arizona's bow. Debris, metal, equipment, human remains rained down across the harbour. The force of the blast was felt miles away. The Arizona's forward structure collapsed. Fire engulfed the ship. Fuel oil spread across the water, igniting into a sea of flame. Men jumped overboard, only to find themselves swimming through burning oil. The Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes. Of her crew of 1,500, more than 1,000 died. Most never made it out of the ship. They were killed instantly by the explosion or trapped below decks as the ship went down. Even today, the Arizona leaks oil. Droplets rise to the surface, slow, steady, endless. They call them the Tears of the Arizona. The USS Nevada was the only battleship that managed to get underway during the attack. Her crew saw the assault developing and made a desperate attempt to reach the open ocean. They cut the mooring lines and started moving down the channel toward the harbour entrance. Japanese pilots saw the Nevada moving and concentrated their attack on her. If the Nevada could be sunk in the channel, she would block the entire harbour, trapping every other ship inside. Bombs struck the Nevada's deck. Fire broke out. The ship was taking heavy damage. Realising that she might not make it to open water, and knowing that sinking in the channel would be disastrous, the Nevada's captain deliberately ran her aground near Hospital Point. She would survive, but she would not escape. The USS California took 2 torpedo hits and settled slowly into the mud. The USS Maryland and USS Pennsylvania were damaged but remained afloat. The USS Tennessee, trapped by the sinking West Virginia, suffered bomb damage but stayed operational. By the time the first wave ended, Battleship Row was a vision of hell. Ships burning. Smoke so thick it turned day into twilight. Bodies in the water. Wreckage everywhere. The harbour was covered in oil that burned with a thick black smoke. And then the second wave arrived. 170 aircraft struck an hour after the first wave. They targeted ships that had survived the initial attack. They hit fuel depots, repair facilities, dry docks. They strafed anything that moved. American forces fought back desperately. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of shrapnel. Sailors worked to save their ships, battling fires and flooding with whatever tools they had. Some used buckets to bail water. Some formed human chains to pass ammunition to gun crews. Men performed acts of extraordinary courage. Petty Officer Doris Miller, a cook on the USS West Virginia, carried wounded sailors to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use, and fired at Japanese aircraft until he ran out of ammunition. Captain Mervyn Bennion, commanding officer of the West Virginia, was mortally wounded by shrapnel but refused to leave his post. He continued giving orders even as he bled out on the deck. At 10 in the morning, it was over. The Japanese aircraft turned north and flew back toward their carriers, which were waiting 200 miles away. They had achieved near-total surprise. They had inflicted catastrophic damage. They had lost only 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 men. The United States lost 8 battleships, either sunk or heavily damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were destroyed, or damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most on the ground. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded. Pearl Harbor, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific, was crippled. But there was something else that happened that day, something less visible but equally significant. The nation united. Before December 7th, America was divided. Isolationists and interventionists argued bitterly about the war in Europe and Asia. Public opinion was fragmented. Congress was gridlocked. Mothers protested. Politicians campaigned on neutrality. The America First Committee held rallies. After December 7th, all of that evaporated. The attack was seen as treacherous, unprovoked, and barbaric. The fact that it came while Japanese diplomats were still in Washington conducting peace negotiations made it even worse. Americans were outraged. The debate over intervention ended instantly. People who had never agreed on anything suddenly agreed on one thing: Japan had to be stopped. Recruiting stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men lined up for blocks, desperate to enlist. Women volunteered for defence work. Factories began converting to military production. The entire nation mobilised with a speed and unity that had seemed impossible just days before. On December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech was brief, direct, and powerful. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He called for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one representative, Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist who had also voted against entry into the First World War, voted against it. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honouring their alliance with Japan. America was now fully committed to the Second World War. In the space of a single morning, everything changed. And this is where the conspiracy theory finds its deepest resonance. Because the outcome of Pearl Harbor was exactly what Roosevelt and his advisors had said was needed. The nation was united. Public opinion shifted overnight. The political obstacles to entering the war vanished. The isolationists were silenced. The debate was over. Critics argue that this is too convenient to be coincidental. They point out that the attack achieved every strategic goal that American leadership had been unable to accomplish through diplomacy or persuasion. It gave the United States the moral high ground. It justified full mobilization. It silenced opposition. Official history says that these outcomes were the result of Japanese aggression and American resilience. The conspiracy theory says they were the result of calculated risk. A gamble that the cost of allowing an attack would be worth the benefit of entering the war, united. To be clear, there is no definitive proof that Roosevelt or his administration deliberately allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. But the question persists because the political and strategic context makes the theory plausible, and because the investigations that followed left too many questions unanswered. The fires burned for days. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage. Survivors wandered in shock, some still covered in oil, some badly burned. And in Washington, officials began preparing their defence. Not defence against Japan, defence against the questions that would inevitably come. How did this happen? Who was responsible? What did you know? And when did you know it? Chapter 7. The Investigations. After Pearl Harbor, the nation demanded answers. How could this have happened? How could the most powerful navy in the world be caught so completely off guard? Who was responsible? Who should be punished? Over the next several years, multiple investigations were conducted, committees formed, hearings were held, witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, and when it was all over, the conclusions were complex, contradictory, and politically charged. The first investigation began immediately after the attack. It was led by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts and included 2 Army generals and 2 Navy admirals. The Roberts Commission was tasked with determining why Pearl Harbor's defences had failed and who was to blame. The commission worked quickly. They arrived in Hawaii on December 22nd, just 15 days after the attack. They interviewed witnesses, they reviewed communications, they examined defensive procedures. On January 23, 1942, they released their findings. The conclusion was damning. Admiral Kimmel and General Short had not taken adequate defensive measures, despite receiving warnings. They had failed to coordinate their defences. They had not properly assessed the threat. They were guilty of dereliction of duty. Both men were immediately relieved of command. Their careers were over, their reputations were destroyed. But Kimmel and Short protested. They argued that the warnings they had received had been vague and incomplete. They claimed that critical intelligence had been withheld from them. They pointed out that Washington had access to information that was never shared with Hawaii. They demanded access to classified materials to defend themselves. Their requests were denied. National security, they were told, wartime secrecy. The intelligence sources could not be revealed. The investigation moved forward without allowing Kimmel and Short to see the evidence that might have exonerated them. Further investigations followed. A Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944, an Army Board later that same year, a joint congressional investigation in 1945 and 1946. Each one examined communications intelligence, reports and decisions made in the weeks before the attack. Each one produced thousands of pages of testimony and analysis. The findings were consistent in some areas and contradictory in others. All of the investigations concluded that there had been failures in communication. Intelligence agencies had not shared information effectively. Warnings had been misunderstood or downplayed. Commanders in Hawaii had not been fully informed of the strategic picture. But none of the investigations found evidence of deliberate negligence or conspiracy. Responsibility was spread across multiple agencies. Some officials were criticised, some procedures were changed, but no single person beyond Kimmel and Short was held accountable for the broader systemic failures. Conspiracy theorists point to the investigations as further evidence of a cover-up. They note that many intelligence documents were classified and withheld from public scrutiny. They argue that the investigations focused on field commanders while protecting higher-level officials. They claim that uncomfortable questions were deflected or ignored. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigations involved the magic intercepts, the decoded Japanese diplomatic messages that American intelligence had been reading for months. The existence of magic was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The ability to read Japanese codes gave the United States an enormous intelligence advantage, and protecting that advantage was considered vital to winning the war. During the early investigations, magic was not mentioned. Witnesses were instructed not to discuss it. Documents referencing magic were withheld. Even the investigators did not have full access to the intercepts. This meant that critical pieces of evidence, messages that might have shown how much Washington knew and when they knew it, were kept out of the official record. It wasn't until after the war ended that magic was declassified, and researchers could finally examine the full scope of intelligence available before Pearl Harbor. What they found was troubling. The intercepts showed that American intelligence had been reading Japanese diplomatic communications for months. They had seen messages indicating that war was imminent. They had intercepted requests for detailed information about Pearl Harbor. They had decoded messages setting deadlines and discussing military preparations. In hindsight, the intelligence was much clearer than officials had admitted during the investigations, but by the time these documents were declassified, most of the key figures were dead. Roosevelt had died in 1945. Many of the senior military officers from 1941 had retired or passed away. The historical record was incomplete, and definitive answers remained elusive. What the investigations did establish was a pattern of institutional failure. Intelligence agencies operated in silos. The Army had its intelligence service. The Navy had its own. The FBI monitored domestic threats. The State Department handled diplomatic intelligence. Each agency collected information, but did not always share effectively with the others. Communication between military branches was poor. The Army was responsible for defending Hawaii from land-based threats. The Navy was responsible for defending against sea-based threats. But there was no unified command structure. No one person was responsible for coordinating all defensive efforts. Assumptions went unchallenged. The prevailing belief that Pearl Harbor was too far from Japan to be attacked was never seriously questioned. Intelligence that contradicted this assumption was dismissed or explained away. Warnings were diluted as they moved through bureaucracy. Clear, urgent assessments from mid-level analysts were softened into vague, bureaucratic language by the time they reached senior officials, and by the time they reached field commanders they had lost most of their urgency. Whether those failures were accidental or intentional is the question that has never been fully resolved. Because in the end, the investigations confirmed that Pearl Harbor could have been prevented, but they did not answer whether anyone chose not to prevent it. Kimmel and Short became the official scapegoats. They were blamed for not doing more with the information they had. But many historians argue that they were set up to fail, given vague warnings, denied critical intelligence, and then blamed when the inevitable happened. Both men spent the rest of their lives trying to clear their names. They wrote letters, they gave interviews, they petitioned for their cases to be reopened. Kimmel died in 1968, still insisting that he had been unfairly blamed for a failure that belonged to Washington. Short died in 1949, bitter and broken. In the decades since, there have been efforts to posthumously restore their ranks and clear their reputations. Some official reviews have concluded that they were not solely responsible for the disaster, but the debate continues. Because if Kimmel and Short were not to blame, then who was? Was it the intelligence agencies that failed to share information? Was it the senior officials who sent vague warnings instead of clear orders? Was it the system itself, designed in a way that made failure almost inevitable? Or was it something more deliberate, a decision made at the highest levels to allow the attack to happen? The investigations never answered that question, and perhaps they were never meant to. Chapter 8. The conspiracy takes shape. In the years following the war, as classified documents were slowly released and veterans began sharing their experiences, a new narrative began to emerge. It started with questions from historians and journalists who noticed inconsistencies in the official record. Why had so much intelligence pointed toward an attack, yet no effective action was taken? Why had field commanders been kept in the dark about the severity of the threat? Why had warnings been so vague? Why had documents been withheld from investigators? Some researchers began to argue that the failures were not failures at all. They were decisions. The conspiracy theory rests on several key claims. First, that American intelligence knew more than it admitted, that the intercepted Japanese communications made it clear that war was imminent and that an attack on Pearl Harbor was possible, if not probable. The magic intercepts support this claim. Messages from late November showed Tokyo setting deadlines, preparing for military action, and requesting detailed intelligence on Pearl Harbor. American codebreakers read these messages in real time. Senior officials in Washington saw them. Second, that this intelligence was deliberately withheld from commanders in Hawaii. That vague warnings were sent not to alert them, but to provide plausible deniability later. The warnings sent to Kimmel and Short emphasized general vigilance, but did not convey the urgency or specificity that would have justified placing Pearl Harbor on full alert. Meanwhile, officials in Washington had access to intelligence that painted a much clearer picture of the threat. Third, that President Roosevelt and his inner circle understood that only a dramatic attack on American soil would unite the nation and justify entry into the war, that they saw Pearl Harbor not as a catastrophe to be prevented, but as an opportunity to be exploited. Roosevelt's political situation in late 1941 supports this interpretation. He believed that American involvement in the war was necessary. He had tried to move public opinion through speeches and diplomacy, but the isolationist movement remained strong. Without a catalyst, he could not bring the nation into the war. And fourth, that after the attack, a coordinated effort was made to obscure the truth, that investigations were steered away from uncomfortable conclusions, that documents were classified, that scapegoats were chosen to protect higher-level officials. The handling of the investigation supports this claim. Critical intelligence was withheld. Key witnesses were not allowed to see classified materials. The focus remained on field commanders rather than systemic failures or decisions made in Washington. To be absolutely clear, this is interpretation, not established fact. There is no smoking gun document in which Roosevelt orders Pearl Harbor to be left undefended. There is no memo that says, "Let the attack happen." The evidence is circumstantial, built on patterns of behaviour, withheld intelligence and strategic outcomes. But the theory persists because it offers an explanation for a series of events that otherwise seem inexplicable. How could so many warnings have been missed? How could so many opportunities to prevent the attack have been squandered? How could the outcome have been so perfectly aligned with American strategic interests? Proponents of the conspiracy theory do not claim that Roosevelt wanted Americans to die. They claim that he made a calculated decision, that the cost of allowing an attack measured in ships, lives and national trauma was worth the benefit of entering the war united and with overwhelming public support. It is a cold calculation, a ruthless one. But it is not without precedent in history. Leaders have always faced impossible choices. Winston Churchill allegedly allowed German bombers to destroy Coventry, rather than reveal that British intelligence had broken German codes. Harry Truman ordered atomic bombs dropped on Japanese cities to end the war quickly. Lyndon Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam based on questionable intelligence about an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Throughout history, leaders have weighed lives against strategy. They have made decisions that cost some to save others. They have chosen silence over transparency when they believed the stakes were high enough. The question is not whether such choices exist. The question is whether Pearl Harbor was one of them. Critics of the conspiracy theory point out that it requires a level of coordination and secrecy that would have been nearly impossible to maintain. It assumes that dozens of officials across multiple agencies all understood the plan and kept silent. It assumes that no one, no aide, no analyst, no clerk, ever spoke out or left evidence of the conspiracy. They argue that the simpler explanation is the correct one, that Pearl Harbor was a genuine surprise enabled by bureaucratic failure, overconfidence, and bad luck. And yet, the questions remain. Because even if the conspiracy theory is not true, the failures that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen were so profound, so systematic, and so consequential that they demand a better answer than mistakes were made. Consider the timeline. July 1941, Roosevelt imposes oil embargo on Japan. Late November, Japanese carriers disappear from intelligence tracking. November 27, vague war warnings sent to Hawaii. December 2nd, Kimmel asks where the carriers are. No one knows. December 6th, final intercepts indicate war will begin within hours. December 7th, morning, radar detects incoming aircraft. Warning ignored. December 7th, morning, submarine sunk in defensive waters. Report delayed. December the 7th, 7:55. Attack begins. At every single step, there were opportunities to prevent or mitigate the disaster. At every single step, those opportunities were not taken. Was that really just bad luck? Or was it something else? That is why the theory endures. Not because there is definitive proof, but because the alternative explanation, that everything went wrong by coincidence, seems almost as hard to believe as the conspiracy itself. Chapter 9. The Moral Question. Strip away the politics, strip away the strategy, strip away the classified documents and the endless debates over who knew what and when. What you're left with is a moral question that has no easy answer. If leaders knew that war was coming, if they knew that Japan was likely to strike, did they have an obligation to prevent that strike, even if it meant prolonging political division and delaying American entry into the war? Or did they have an obligation to allow the strike, understanding that only a direct attack would unite the nation and enable the mobilization needed to defeat fascism? This is the terrain of moral philosophy, not history. And it is the terrain on which the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory ultimately rests. Let's explore both sides. On one side, there is the argument for transparency and defense. Leaders have a duty to protect their people. That is the most fundamental responsibility of government. If an attack can be prevented, it must be prevented. To knowingly allow Americans to die, even for strategic reasons, is a betrayal of the social contract between government and citizen. The men who died at Pearl Harbor did not consent to be sacrificed. They were sailors and soldiers doing their jobs, trusting that their leaders would do everything possible to keep them safe. If those leaders chose to withhold warnings or intelligence that might have saved lives, then those leaders violated that trust in the most profound way. From this perspective, The ends do not justify the means. Even if allowing Pearl Harbor to happen brought the nation into the war and ultimately saved millions of lives, the decision to sacrifice 2,000 Americans without their knowledge or consent was morally wrong. On the other side, there is the argument for the greater good. Leaders must sometimes make terrible choices. They must weigh competing interests and decide which outcome will cause the least harm in the long run. In late 1941, Roosevelt faced an impossible situation. He believed, correctly, as history would prove, that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan posed existential threats, not just to their neighbours, but to human freedom itself. Millions were already dying in Europe and Asia. Britain was on the brink of collapse. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. China was being devastated. If the United States remained neutral, the Axis powers might win. The consequences of that outcome would be catastrophic, not just for Europe and Asia, but eventually for the United States itself. But the American public would not support intervention. They wanted to stay out of foreign wars. They believed the ocean would protect them. No amount of speeches or diplomacy could change their minds. From this perspective, allowing Pearl Harbor to happen, if that's what occurred, was a terrible choice made in service of a greater good. 2,000 lives were lost, but their sacrifice brought the nation into a war that ultimately saved millions and prevented the triumph of totalitarianism. This is utilitarian ethics, the calculation of lives saved versus lives lost, the greater good versus individual rights. It is the same ethical framework that would later justify dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians died, but the alternative, a full invasion of Japan, might have cost millions of lives on both sides. So which framework is correct? That depends on what you believe about the nature of leadership and the limits of acceptable sacrifice. If you believe that leaders must never knowingly sacrifice their own people, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was an unforgivable betrayal. If you believe that leaders must sometimes make terrible choices to prevent even worse outcomes, then Pearl Harbor, if deliberately allowed, was a tragic but necessary decision. There is no right answer. There is only the answer that each person must reach for themselves based on their own moral framework. But consider this thought experiment. Imagine you are President Roosevelt in November 1941. You know that Nazi Germany has conquered most of Europe. You know that the Holocaust is underway, though the full scale is not yet understood. You know that Britain is barely holding on, dependent on American supplies that are being sunk by German submarines. You know that if Britain falls, the United States will face a hostile Europe alone. You know that Japan is expanding across Asia, committing atrocities in China, and threatening American interest in the Pacific. You know that economic pressure has made war with Japan almost inevitable. You know that your own nation refuses to enter the war. 80% of Americans oppose intervention. Congress will not declare war without overwhelming public support. The isolationists are powerful and vocal. You believe deeply, with every fibre of your being, that American involvement is necessary, that without it, the Axis will win and the world will fall into darkness. Then intelligence reports indicate that Japan may be preparing to attack American territory. The attack could be prevented with decisive action, dispersing the fleet, placing Hawaii on full alert, scrambling reconnaissance flights. But preventing the attack means maintaining the status quo. The nation remains divided. The war in Europe continues without American involvement. Millions more die while you watch helplessly. Allowing the attack means accepting terrible losses. Ships will be sunk, men will die, but the nation will unite overnight. Public opinion will shift instantly. Congress will declare war, and American power, industrial, military, moral, will be brought to bear against fascism. What do? Do you prevent the attack and accept that the war may be lost without American involvement? Or do you allow the attack knowing that the lives lost will be the price of victory? This is the question that the Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory forces us to confront, and it has no easy answer, because the truth is, we don't know what we would do in that situation. We can theorize, we can argue, we can apply ethical frameworks, but unless you are actually faced with that choice, unless you bear that responsibility, you cannot know for certain what decision you would make. This is why the conspiracy theory persists even in the absence of definitive proof. Because it asks a question that goes beyond Pearl Harbor. It asks, what are the limits of acceptable sacrifice? It asks, can leaders justify sacrificing some to save others? It asks, who gets to make that decision, and who has to live with the consequences? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that every generation must answer when faced with impossible choices. Pearl Harbor forces us to ask them. Whether the attack was allowed to happen or not, the moral question remains. Chapter 10. Why the question persists. 80 years have passed since Pearl Harbor. The generation that fought the Second World War is almost gone. The ships that sank that day have been memorialized. The Arizona remains underwater, a tomb for the men who never left. The lessons have been studied in military academies around the world. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry, a warning against complacency. And yet, the question refuses to die. Why? Part of the answer is incomplete information. Many documents related to Pearl Harbor remain classified. Some were destroyed during the war, others were lost or misfiled, and some decisions were made in private conversations that left no record. Phone calls between Roosevelt and his advisors, discussions in the Oval Office, orders given verbally rather than in writing. Without complete transparency, doubt persists. Researchers continue to file Freedom of Information Act requests. Archives are periodically reviewed. Occasionally new documents surface, but the full picture remains elusive. Part of the answer is historical pattern. Pearl Harbor was not the first time that a nation was caught off guard by an attack. And in the decades since, there have been other intelligence failures, other moments where warnings were missed or ignored. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where reports of North Vietnamese attacks on American ships were later revealed to be exaggerated or misinterpreted, leading to American escalation in Vietnam. The Iranian Revolution in 1979, where American intelligence failed to predict the fall of the Shah despite clear signs of instability. September 11th, 2001, where intelligence agencies had information suggesting that terrorists were planning attacks using aircraft, but the warnings were not acted upon effectively. Each time, questions arise. Were these genuine failures, or were they something more? The repetition of the pattern makes conspiracy theories more plausible. It suggests that intelligence failures are not anomalies, they are features of the system. Part of the answer is the outcome itself. Pearl Harbor did unite the nation. It did enable American entry into the war. It did lead to the defeat of fascism, and in hindsight, it is almost impossible to imagine the Second World War ending the way it did without American involvement. American industrial power produced the ships, aircraft, tanks and supplies that overwhelmed the Axis. American manpower tipped the balance in Europe and the Pacific. American resources sustained the Allied war effort. Without Pearl Harbor, would the United States have entered the war at all? And if not, what would the world look like today? So even if the attack was not deliberately allowed, it achieved the result that leadership needed. And that makes it hard to separate failure from intent, because the consequences of Pearl Harbor were exactly what Roosevelt had argued was necessary. The nation mobilized, public opinion shifted, the isolationists were silenced, and America became, in Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Researchers will continue to debate, new documents will be declassified, new analyses will be published, conferences will be held, books will be written. But a definitive answer may never come, because the question of Pearl Harbor is not really about evidence. It is about trust. Do we trust that leaders tell us the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable? Do we trust that when disasters happen, they happen because of mistakes, not choices? Do we trust that those in power prioritize our safety over strategic goals? These are not questions that documents can answer. They are questions that each person must answer for themselves, based on their understanding of history and their beliefs about human nature. For some, the official narrative is sufficient. Pearl Harbor was a tragedy. It was a failure of communication, coordination and preparedness. It was a lesson learned. The system was reformed. Safeguards were put in place. It won't happen again. For others, the gaps in the story are too large to ignore. They see a pattern of warnings missed, decisions delayed, and outcomes too convenient. They see documents withheld, investigations limited, and scapegoats chosen, and they conclude that something more was happening beneath the surface. And for all of us, Pearl Harbor remains a reminder of how fragile security can be, and how quickly the world can change. Because that's what Pearl Harbor demonstrated most powerfully. In a matter of hours, everything changed. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. And once that change happened, there was no going back. The America that existed on December 6th, 1941, was gone forever. The isolationism that had defined American foreign policy for decades was finished. The debate over intervention was over. Pearl Harbor created a new America, one that would emerge from the war as a superpower, with military bases around the world, alliances across continents, and a permanent role in global affairs. That transformation was inevitable once the attack happened. The question is whether someone understood that and made sure the attack happened. Epilogue. The line between failure and choice. Stand at the memorial today, and you can still see the outline of the USS Arizona beneath the water. The white memorial structure spans the sunken hull, reflecting in the calm harbour. Oil still seeps from the ship, slow, dark droplets rising to the surface. They call them the tears of the Arizona, the tears that never stop. More than 2,000 names are inscribed on the walls. Each one represents a life cut short, a family shattered, a future erased. Young men who never got to grow old, who never got to see their children, who never got to live the lives they had planned. Pearl Harbor is remembered as a day of infamy, a surprise attack, a turning point in history. But history is rarely as simple as the monuments we build to commemorate it, because underneath the heroism and the sacrifice and the unity that followed, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Was Pearl Harbor a failure to see the warning signs, or was it a decision to let them unfold? Official history tells us it was the former. The conspiracy theory suggests it was the latter. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps it was not a deliberate conspiracy, but a series of choices to prioritise some intelligence over others, to delay action, to avoid confrontation, to hope that diplomacy might still work, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Perhaps it was not malice, but calculation, recognition that war was inevitable, and that the question was not whether to fight, but how to enter the fight with the nation behind you. Perhaps the line between failure and choice is thinner than we want to believe. Because in the end, the question is not just about Pearl Harbor. It is about every moment in history when leaders faced impossible decisions. Every time they weighed lives against strategy. Every time they chose silence over transparency. Every time they let events unfold because intervention seemed worse than inaction. And it is about what we, as citizens, demand from those who lead us. Do we demand the truth, even when it is painful? Do we demand accountability, even when it is inconvenient? Do we demand that our safety comes first, even when the cost is high? Or do we accept that sometimes the greater good requires sacrifice, and that those sacrifices are made without our knowledge or consent? These are not easy questions. They are the questions that Pearl Harbor forces us to ask. On December the 7th, 1941, the world changed in a matter of hours. A nation that had been divided became united. A war that had been distant became immediate. A future that had been uncertain became clear. Whether that change was the result of failure or choice, accident or design, is something each person must decide for themselves. But one thing is certain. When history shifts overnight, when the unthinkable becomes real, when the warnings we ignored become the disasters we must face, we cannot help but ask, was it destiny, or was it decision? And if it was decision, whose decision was it? The fires burned for 3 days at Pearl Harbor. The smoke could be seen from miles away. Bodies were pulled from the water and from the wreckage for weeks. Some were never found. The Arizona still holds more than 900 men in her hull. They were never recovered. The ship is their tomb. Every year survivors of Pearl Harbor and, now descendants of survivors, gather at the memorial. They drop flower petals into the water. They remember the friends they lost. They tell their stories to younger generations. And they always ask the same question: could this have been prevented? The official investigation said no, or at least not without information that commanders did not have. The conspiracy theorists say yes, with information that was deliberately withheld. The truth is probably more complex than either answer suggests, because preventing Pearl Harbor would have required many things to go right. It would have required intelligence agencies to share information effectively. It would have required warnings to be specific and urgent. It would have required field commanders to be given full access to classified materials. It would have required someone in authority to challenge the prevailing assumptions about Japan's capabilities and intentions. All of that was possible, none of it happened. Whether that was failure or choice, incompetence or strategy, is the question that will haunt Pearl Harbor forever. Because the answer matters. If Pearl Harbor was a failure, then we learn lessons about communication, coordination, and vigilance. We reform institutions. We create safeguards. We try to prevent it from happening again. If Pearl Harbor was a choice, then we confront uncomfortable truths about power, sacrifice, and the limits of democracy. We ask whether leaders can be trusted. We question official narratives. We demand transparency. Both answers have consequences, and neither answer brings back the men who died. So we remember them. We memorialize them. We tell their stories, and we ask the question that refuses to die. When a nation is caught off guard, is it because no one saw it coming, or because someone chose not to look? The oil still rises from the Arizona, the tears still fall, and the question still remains. Thank you for listening.